paper is on Winston Churchill and the complexity of honor and statesmanship. Rarely can you find a statesman who exemplified the characteristics of honor better than Winston Churchill. His life was unique, and from a very early age, he would lead a life of military valor, political excellence, writing, all in the public eye. For that reason, Churchill earned high honors. Moreover, he wrote about honor. Statesman, a soldier, a writer, a rhetorician, hero to many, and recipient of many high honors from several different countries, Churchill is uniquely situated to explore honor. Yet in his early life, Churchill was skeptical about the concept of honor. He lived in an era of incredible change and uncertainty. Later, he would go on to defend honor rhetorically and to symbolize honor to his country, the West, and the world. So Churchill's complicated. Statesmanship is always complicated. It's not a treatise. We've got to find everything in it. And he wrote between 8 and 10 million words. So it's always kind of a search for everything, and everybody asks about quotes, and okay, you know the quote, I don't. But the thing about Churchill you have to understand is his historical scope, and his understanding of history is different than everybody else's. Isaiah Berlin, the philosopher, worked for him during World War II, and he wrote this: Churchill's dominant category, the single central organizing principle of his moral and intellectual universe is his historical imagination, so strong, so comprehensive as to encase the whole of the present and the whole of the future in a framework of rich and multicolored past. Such an approach, dominated by a desire and a capacity to find fixed moral and intellectual bearings, to give shape and character and color and direction and coherence to the stream of events. That's what he develops over time, and that's what changes his view of honor. As a young man, he wrote one novel, Savonarola, and in that novel he says, honor, because it has no true foundation, no ultra-human sanction. Its codes are constantly changing with times and places. At one time, it is thought more honorable to kill a man you have wronged than to make amends. At another time, important to pay a bookmaker than a butcher. Like art, it changes with human caprice, and like art, it comes from opulence and luxury. So this is the young man's view of honor. This is how he starts. It's relative. He comes from civilization or history or codes of behavior. But all civilizations and codes, according to this, can be advanced or developed or degenerated or ended. Churchill's had experience with historic codes. He was at Sandhurst. He embraced these things. But he had to develop this kind of history in order to actually become more sophisticated about honor. When I started this paper, I expected it to be all about the military. Churchill was this great soldier. He fought in 15 battles. He was the First Lord of the Admiralty twice. He's the figure we think of in World War II with the military. And yeah, it's there, but it's not the dominant force I expected it to be. You know, he thought soldiers were honorable. He thought they were heroes. He talked about the heroism of the British people during all kinds of different speeches. He talked about the honor of the French. But it was never the central focus the way I thought it would be. As somebody who was a soldier that fought in Afghanistan and Cuba and Sudan and in France, I thought he would have been all about that kind of heroism. But this is kind of, I think, one of the keys here. He wrote, I wonder often whether any other generation had seen such astounding revolutions of data and values as those through which we have lived. Scarcely anything material or established which I was taught to believe was permanent and vital and has lasted. Everything I was sure to be was impossible has happened, and that included soldiering. And that was one of the keys to the soldiering kind of thing. He thought they were honorable, they were so important and heroes, but honor was never the focus here of his locus. Rhetoric. It's the rhetorical Churchill that we think of when we think of his views of honor. I focused on 4 of the most famous quotes that he had. Never give in, never give in, never, 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 in nothing, great or small, large or petty, never give in except to convictions of honor and good sense. Following words, freedom, democracy, and liberation are distortion of their true meaning, he says in another one, and it comes down to honor, honorable purposes. All the greatest things are simple, and many can be expressed in one single word: freedom, justice, honor, duty, mercy, hope. All of these things are what made Churchill famous, great. It's the things that our understanding of him come, the rhetorical brilliance. It's why we look at him and honor, but it's not what he thought about honor. That thought comes from one incident. Everybody kind of knows about Munich. Munich was the famous appeasement flight. And Chamberlain comes back and says, there'll be peace with honor, peace in our time. And this triggers in Churchill extended thoughts on honor in writing in different places. So his initial reaction is, this is the greatest example of dishonor. And then he writes again about the kind of more moderate and gentle honor when Chamberlain dies, kind of owed to him. But then comes the real, most important part. In his World War II volume, he writes about the tragedy of Munich. And it's all about a kind of example for future statesmen of how to make decisions, and it turns on honor. And Czechoslovakia turned on honor. Okay, let me get to the... Okay, he wrote, "It may well be here to set down some principles and morals of actions which may guide the future. No case of this kind can be judged apart from its circumstances. The facts may be unknown at the time, and estimates of them must be largely guesswork, colored by general feelings and aims of whoever is trying to pronounce." He goes on to talk about circumstance. Judgment for him is critical in these thoughts. Circumstances can be complicated. This, quote, peacemaker is something he was not, or understood in international relations as changeability. Under his criterion only, Chamberlain made a good decision initially. Churchill next turns to the thorny issue of religion and political ethics. This could be controversial, but Churchill handles it pretty adroitly. He was never considered a particularly religious guy. For Churchill, Christian ethics preclude the use of force and except under very narrow circumstances, so Christian ethics are not part of what a statesman can use to keep a state safe. This is the problem that continually plagued Christian countries. Churchill wrote, "The Sermon on the Mount is the last word in Christian ethics. Everyone respects the Quakers. Still, it is not on these terms that ministers assume their responsibilities to guiding states. Their duty is first to deal with other nations and to avoid strife and war and to eschew aggression in all forms, whether for nationalistic or idealistic objects. The safety of the state, the lives and the freedom of their fellow countrymen to whom they owe their position make it right and imperative in the last resort, when a final definitive conviction has been reached, that the use of force should not be excluded." statesmen at the end have to decide that the most important imperative is to keep people free and safe. If they're free and safe, that's what Churchill thought, and religion sometimes didn't allow statesmen to do that. The priority of national defense is where Churchill is most critical of Chamberlain, because Chamberlain neither kept the British people safe nor ensured the freedom of the Czechs and others. He believed there are times when a statesman must disregard his faith beliefs and do what will keep his people safe. Keeping people safe and free requires judgment, must include the full range of options, including keeping the threat of force as an option. Up to this point, Churchill had talked about morals, ethics, circumstances, but not honor. He is about to show how honor becomes the critical factor in everything he's discussed. Quote, "There is, however, one helpful guide, namely for a nation to keep its word and to act in accordance with its treaty obligation to its allies. The guide is called honor. It is baffling to reflect that what men call honor does not correspond always to Christian ethics. Honor is often influenced by the element of pride, which plays so large a part in its inspiration. An exaggerated code of honor leading to the performance of utterly vain and unreasonable deeds could not be defended, however fine it might look. Here, however, the moment came when honor pointed the path to duty, and when also right judgments of the facts at the times would have reinforced its dictates." Churchill coalesces his critical paragraph in which everything he previously written about honor is important. Simple justice requires a country to back its allies, keep its word, live up to its treaty obligations. However, leadership is often more complicated. Pride is the motivation behind honor, but the extremes of honor, including pride, often lead the wrong way. That is, towards personal glory and wrong-headed policies, instead of towards the goal of keeping the citizens of a country safe and free. For Churchill, much of what transpired in Munich relates to this. All that Churchill wrote earlier about Christian ethics not applying to honor comes to play in his analysis. Pride is one of the 7 deadly sins. Because of Churchill, pride is part of honor. Then honor cannot correspond to a Christian virtue. Instead, pride must be rightly reined in so it is not used badly. Now we have the final element that the mature Churchill believed involved honor. Honor is tied to pride, can't go wrong without having a great deal of experience to moderate and direct it. We put together what Churchill wrote in 1940 with what he wrote above, we can finally understand Churchill's concept of honor for leaders in the modern world. Uncontrolled pride leads people to act recklessly. Pride controlled by duty, judgment, and circumstance usually yields an honorable end. Duty is tied to countries, civilizations, codes of behavior, and chivalry. Duty helps moderate pride because it makes individuals part of something larger. For Churchill, it was his sense of being an Englishman that gave him a sense of duty and moderated his outside pride. Judgment involves conscience, rectitude, and sincerity. Conscience moderates pride by giving a person a sense of right and wrong, a preference for doing right. Rectitude moderates pride by emphasizing the goodness in moral choices, includes kindness and respect. Sincerity moderates pride by illuminating genuine actions free of deception or treachery. Taken all together, conscience, rectitude, and sincerity make it more difficult to succumb to false pride. Duty and judgment help make good decisions. Winston Churchill was an excellent example of a statesman who wrote about honor, but what he wrote and believed were unconventional, I think. Anyone who spent as much time in and around the military would be expected to focus on the individual heroic actions as the focus of honor in the modern world. However, although Churchill acknowledged heroism, and knew it led to great recognition, it was not the focus of his beliefs, and especially as he matured. Instead, Churchill went through an evolution in his thinking about honor. As a young writer, Churchill believed honor was relative, subject to variation, and within any society over time without a guiding principle. He modified this belief over time, and in much of his writing, he was still convinced that honor was not innate, but pertained to civilized codes of behavior. Churchill also desired awards and honors as a young man, while understanding the great challenges and dangers of military life that went with the awards. Yet most of the awards yielded little in understanding honor. For Churchill, the most important theory that generally dominates his life and writings is his expansive vision of history. His historicism is familial, personal, distinguished, largely British, and unique. Churchill's view of honor is always linked to his writings of history. The more sophisticated Churchill histories became, the more deep his understanding of honor became. Churchill cultivated intellectual worldliness in the 1930s, finally led to his mature understanding of honor. Churchill was not a religious man, but his understanding of religion, and referred to it many times in his writings, he concluded that religion could not be the guide for statesmen because they must focus on making their country safe and free. To make people safe, politicians must do things that went against the tenets of most religions, like attack other countries or execute traitors. Therefore, honor becomes more important to Churchill, and because honor becomes the guide to actions where religion cannot. For Churchill, honor is associated with Great Britain, other Western countries, civilizations, codes of honor like chivalry. Honor was a product of those institutions, which means it can change over time. But because it was tied to great, historic, generally good places like Great Britain, it was good. Implied but not stated is any claim to a country to honor by a country like Nazi Germany would be corrupt because of the underlying regime being corrupt. Churchill understood the nuances of honor and could not be refined rhetorically. He knew that honor had to be understood simply as a natural good thing. He never defines honor in speeches, but instead it stands as something that the beholder could define. Implied is that honor is good, keeping one's word, fulfilling treaty obligations, fighting for your family, friends, and country. Honor becomes the historical inspiration point for Churchill in his speeches that helped his people and ensured his place in history. Thank you.
All right, we have time for questions from anybody.
I have a question.
Sure.
To what extent was his understanding